He thought he was in heaven. The music was too beautiful for earth-rich, soul-deep harmonies floating into the sterile white room, each note carrying something he didn't recognize at first, a strange, almost unbearable warmth. Reverend Thomas Calloway's eyes blinked open for the first time in 1,095 days. The ceiling above him was the same dull beige from the last Sunday he remembered preaching, yet everything felt sharper now, almost painfully alive. And then came the voices. They weren't hymns from his church, no, Amazing Grace, sung in the neat, restrained way his mostly white congregation preferred. This was raw. It soared and dipped like waves, layered with claps, hums, and shouts. It was different, and Thomas had spent a lifetime avoiding different. He turned his head slowly, painfully toward the source of the sound. Through the open hospital window, he saw them, a group of black men and women, robes shimmering in the morning sun, singing with their eyes closed, hands lifted high. Their joy wasn't polite, it was explosive. It hit him in the chest harder than any sermon he'd ever given. His lips moved, but his throat was dry, a croak escaping instead of words. A nurse, young, black, with tired eyes, rushed to his bedside, her hand pressing gently to his shoulder. "You're awake," she whispered, but it felt like a declaration. "Welcome back, Reverend." Her voice trembled, and he caught the flicker in her eyes. Relief, yes, but also something else. Something guarded. He tried to speak again, but she leaned closer. "Don't push yourself. You've been in a coma for 3 years. 3 years. The words hit him harder than the music. His mind scrambled his last memory, a sermon about preserving tradition, his voice echoing in that whitewashed sanctuary. He had been warning his congregation about the dangers of cultural dilution, his polished way of saying what he really meant. And now he woke to this. "Who are they?" His voice was rasped, brittle. The nurse followed his gaze out the window and smiled faintly. "That's the New Hope Gospel Choir. They sing here every Sunday morning. Mostly for the patients who don't get visitors anymore." He swallowed hard. His mouth was sandpaper. "For me?" She hesitated. "No, Reverend. Not for you. But maybe today it is." Something in her tone made his chest tighten. He noticed the small gold cross hanging around her neck, the same faith but carried differently, worn like a lived story rather than a symbol of authority. Outside, the choir's leader, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, lifted his hands, and the music swelled. Thomas felt the walls of the hospital room vanish. He was in the middle of something vast, something that stretched beyond the lines he had drawn his whole life. And for the first time, he didn't know whether to be afraid or grateful. The first night after waking was the longest of his life. Machines beeped rhythmically beside him, the quiet broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes. He stared at the ceiling, unable to escape the choir's sound still echoing in his mind. It wasn't just music. It was confrontation. In the darkness, fragments of his past sermons drifted backlands that once earned him nods of approval from the pews. "We must preserve the purity of our worship. God gave each people their place. Diversity is the devil's distraction." He had believed them, truly believed. And yet here he was, heart still pounding from the sound of voices he once called too worldly. By morning, the nurse returned her name tag read Angela. She adjusted his fore and asked how he was feeling. "Alive," he said slowly. "I think. That's a start," she replied, but her tone was cautious. He studied her face. "You know me?" Angela's eyes met his without flinching. "I know of you. My grandmother watched your sermons on TV every Sunday. She stopped the day you said God didn't want races to mix in the church." The words landed heavy. He searched for something to defend himself, but the truth was, he had said it, and he had meant it. Instead, he asked, "Why are you here then, taking care of me?" Angela didn't smile. "Because you're my patient. Because my faith tells me to serve, even if the person I'm serving might not have done the same for me." Her honesty sliced deeper than any accusation. The next Sunday, the choir returned. Thomas, now strong enough to sit upright, asked Angela to open the window wider. She raised an eyebrow, but obliged. The cold air swept in along with a burst of sound so rich it made him close his eyes. This time, he listened differently, not as a critic, but as a man desperate to understand. The song's words were about chains breaking, about captives being set free. And Thomas couldn't help but feel it wasn't just about his story, it was about him. Through the glass, his eyes locked with the choir leader's. The man's voice was deep, commanding, yet filled with something unexpected, compassion. For a heartbeat, Thomas wondered if the man knew exactly who he was and was singing anyway. Angela approached later, holding a small folded note. From them, she said simply, placing it on his lap. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, in neat handwriting, it read, "We believe in second chances. If you ever want to talk, we're here." Thomas stared at the words for a long time. Something was happening inside him, something unsettling yet strangely hopeful. And for the first time in his ministry, he didn't have the sermon ready. He just had questions. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. The note lay on his bedside table, its edges curling slightly under the hum of the air conditioner. "We believe in second chances." The words wouldn't leave him alone. They were dangerous words, the kind that threatened the comfort of old convictions. He had built an entire identity on being certain. He was a man of the pulpit, the kind who spoke in absolutes. But after 3 years in silence, his voice was rusty, and his certainties felt even rustier. By the second week of his recovery, the whispers started. Hospital staff didn't hide their curiosity. Some glanced at him with pity, others with something sharper recognition. Thomas had been on local television for years. His sermons weren't exactly subtle. Now, the man who preached separation sat in a ward where most of the caregivers were Black or Latino. He overheard 2 orderlies talking near the nurse's station. "Can you believe that's him?" one said. "Yeah. My mom used to call him the segregation preacher. Wonder how he feels now, waking up to a choir like that." They laughed softly, but it wasn't cruel, it was disbelieving. That was the worst part. The disbelief. On the 3rd Sunday after his awakening, Thomas asked Angela a question he never thought he'd utter. "Do you think," he began cautiously, "they would let me meet them?" Angela didn't answer right away. She adjusted his blanket, checked his chart. "Depends," she said finally. "On what?" "On whether you want to meet them to argue, or to listen." Her words were a scalpel. He felt the old instinct Rosito defend himself, to frame his beliefs as biblical truth. But he swallowed it. "To listen," he said, surprising even himself. Angela studied him for a long moment, as if trying to detect a lie. "I'll ask," she said and left. The following Sunday, the window opened not just to music but to an invitation. The choir's leader, the man with the salt and pepper hair, stood outside with his hands tucked into his robe's sleeves. He glanced up toward Thomas's room and gave a short nod, as if this meeting was inevitable. Angela wheeled him out into the courtyard, the sun warming his skin for the first time in years. The choir had just finished a song and now stood in a semicircle, murmuring among themselves. The leader stepped forward. Reverend Calloway. The voice was deep, resonant, and unhurried. Thomas felt small. I heard your singing. It woke me." "Then maybe it's time you stay awake," the man said evenly. "Name's Elijah Brooks. Pastor like you. Different kind of congregation." Thomas tried to smile, but it came out stiff. "It's powerful music you have." "It's more than music," Elijah replied. "It's history. It's our story. Every note carries the weight of people who sang through chains, whips, and burning crosses. You hear harmony. We hear survival." Thomas's gaze dropped to his lap. "I never thought of it that way." "That's the problem," Elijah said, and there was no malice in it, just fact. For the next hour, Thomas listened. Really listened. The choir members shared fragments of their lives, how they sang at prisons, nursing homes, and street corners. How music was the thread that kept their community together through generations of loss and injustice. A middle-aged woman named Loretta told him about her father, who had been denied treatment at a white-only hospital in the 1960s. "He died on the back porch," she said quietly, while a white pastor prayed for his soul, but never once challenged the rules that kept him out. The words hit like a blow. Thomas thought of all the times he'd prayed for the world's lost souls, without ever questioning the systems that kept them lost. When the meeting ended, Elijah extended a hand. "We'll be here next Sunday, Reverend. Whether you come to watch or to sing is up to you." Sing. The very idea was absurd, but it lodged in his mind and wouldn't let go. Over the next few weeks, Thomas's recovery progressed. He could walk short distances with a cane now. He no longer needed the oxygen tube. But the biggest change was invisibly he found himself replaying every sermon he'd ever preached, hearing them now through different ears. Angela caught him one morning scribbling in a notebook. "What's that?" she asked. "My old sermons," he admitted, trying to see if there's anything in them worth keeping. She raised an eyebrow, and he gave a humorless chuckle. "So far, not much." Then came the day that broke him open. It was raining hard, the kind of relentless southern rain that blurred the world into watercolor. The choir still came, huddled under umbrellas, their voices undampened. Thomas sat by the window, cane in hand, watching. They sang a song he'd never heard, something about walking through the fire and not being burned. Halfway through, Elijah looked up and locked eyes with him. Without breaking the rhythm, he gestured for Thomas to come. Thomas hesitated, then pushed himself to his feet. Angela appeared instantly. "You sure?" He nodded. "I need to." She grabbed an umbrella and walked beside him into the rain. By the time they reached the choir, Thomas was soaked, but he barely noticed. Elijah stepped aside, making space in the circle. "We've been singing around you," he said. "Now we sing with you." Thomas's voice was untrained, his pitch shaky, but when he joined in, something strange happened. The others didn't adjust to match him, adjusted to match them. The harmony found him, surrounded him, lifted him. And for the first time in decades, Thomas Calloway wasn't leading. He was following. That night, he dreamed of his old church. The pews were filled with faces, some he knew, some he didn't. His father sat in the front row, arms crossed, the way he used to whenever Thomas deviated from the good old gospel. Behind him, Elijah stood in the pulpit, preaching not about separation but about reconciliation. When Thomas awoke, tears stained his pillow. The next Sunday, Thomas asked Elijah if he could address the choir. "I have nothing polished to say," he began, voice trembling, "but I need to tell you the truth. I built my life on a narrow piece of scripture and ignored the rest. I preached love but practiced fear. I wrapped it in theology so it looked holy, but it was just prejudice in a suit. And I am sorry." The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with something heavier than humidity. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Loretta stepped forward, her eyes wet. "We can't rewrite the past, Reverend, but we can decide the next verse." Elijah nodded. "You want to make it right? Start by singing louder than you ever preached." News travels fast in small towns. By Monday morning, people who hadn't thought about Reverend Thomas Calloway in years were suddenly talking about him again. Only now, the gossip wasn't about his Coma, it was about the fact that he'd been seen singing with a black choir. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter slipped under his hospital door. No return address, just 3 sentences written in a shaky but angry hand. "I thought you were a man of the book. Mixing with those people is a betrayal. If you've lost your way, stay lost." Thomas read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. He wasn't sure if he felt more hurt or ashamed that the words sounded like something he might have written once upon a time. Angela noticed his silence over breakfast. "You've been frowning at that oatmeal for 20 minutes, she said, pulling up a chair. "I got a letter," he admitted. She didn't even blink. "Let me guess, someone from your old congregation?" "Probably." She tilted her head. And they're not wrong. Not about me losing my way. Only I think I might have been lost for a long time before this." Angela smiled faintly. "That's the thing about finding the truth, it makes your old path look like a maze." By Wednesday, the letters became phone calls. Some were polite but firm, urging him to remember the church's legacy. Others were laced with venom. And then came the one that shook him, an invitation to preach again at his old church. At first, he assumed it was a trick. But the note was signed by Deacon Harold Simmons, the man who had stood by him for 20 years, the one who once told Thomas he was God's bulldog for defending the purity of the flock. "Come back this Sunday," the note read. "Set the record straight." Thomas lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the note burning in his mind. He knew exactly what they wanted, a public reassurance that he was still the man they remembered. When Sunday arrived, Thomas didn't go to his old church. He went to the courtyard instead, where the New Hope Gospel Choir was already gathering. Elijah raised an eyebrow when he saw him. "You had somewhere else to be, didn't you?" Thomas exhaled. "Yes, but I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The choir began to sing, and Thomas joined in, not loudly, but steadily. Halfway through the second verse, a shadow fell across the courtyard. A group of people had gathered just beyond the gate. Thomas recognized several faces from his old congregation. Deacon Simmons stood at the front, arms folded. When the song ended, Simmons stepped forward. "We need to talk, Thomas." They sat at a picnic table off to the side. Simmons's voice was low but sharp. "You're confusing people. Folks are saying you've gone soft on the truth. You know what the Bible says about staying separate?" Thomas looked him straight in the eye. "I know what we always said about it, but I'm starting to think we got it wrong." Simmons's jaw tightened. "You're letting emotion cloud your doctrine. These people," he glanced toward the choir, "they've got their ways, we've got ours. Mixing them just leads to trouble." Thomas felt the old heat rising in his chest, the reflex to defend, to argue scripture verse for verse. But instead, he said quietly, "Harold, maybe the trouble is what we've been avoiding." Simmons stood abruptly. "You've changed. And not for the better." He turned and walked away, the others following. That night, Thomas sat alone in his room, replaying the encounter. He thought about all the Sundays he had stood in that pulpit, wearing his best suit and delivering his most polished prejudices, wrapped in Bible verses like ribbons around a stick of dynamite. And he thought about the choir, the way they sang, as if the music came from a place deeper than memory. For the first time, he prayed not for God to vindicate him, but to change him. The media storm hit the following week. Someone had filmed him singing in the rain with the choir and posted it online. The video went viral not because of his voice, which was unremarkable, but because of the story. Segregationist pastor sings with black choir after 3-year coma. Cable news wanted interviews. Religious blogs lit up with debates. Some called it a miracle, others called it betrayal. Angela read the comments aloud one afternoon, her voice alternating between amused and disgusted. Here's one. "Guess 3 years in a coma will rot your brain." And here's another. "Maybe God put him to sleep so he could wake him up right." Thomas chuckled at the second one. "I like that one." 2 weeks later, Elijah approached him after rehearsal. "We've been asked to sing at the Unity Festival downtown next month. Big crowd. Media coverage. I want you there." Thomas hesitated. "As a singer? As someone who's living proof that people can change," Elijah said. The thought made his stomach knot. What if they see right through me? What if they remember who I was? Elijah's gaze was steady. They will. And that's the point. Word of his involvement reached his old church quickly. This time, the backlash was louder. He received emails warning him he'd answer to God for promoting false unity. One letter stood out, a neatly typed page from a woman named Mrs. Ruth Caldwell. "Reverend, I raised my kids on your sermons. I believed every word. And now I'm questioning it all. Not because I want to, but because if you can change, maybe I have to. I don't know if I'm ready. But I'm listening." He read the letter 3 times, then tucked it into his Bible. The Unity Festival came on a clear autumn day. The downtown square buzzed with food stalls, music stages, and children weaving through the crowd with balloon animals. Backstage, Thomas could feel his heart pounding. The choir members milled around, adjusting robes, laughing, praying together. Elijah approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember," Elijah said, "you're not here to prove you're perfect. You're here to prove it's never too late to start over." When they walked on stage, the crowd erupted not just for the choir, but for him. He could hear murmurs ripple through the audience. "That's him, the pastor from the video." They launched into their first song, and Thomas sang with everything he had. By the third verse, the fear had loosened its grip, replaced by something else: joy. Not the polite joy of a well-rehearsed church hymn, but the fierce, uncontainable joy of freedom. When the song ended, Elijah stepped aside and gestured for Thomas to speak. Thomas took the mic, the crowd going still. "I was a man who thought he knew God," he began. "But what I knew was my own fear, dressed up as faith. I told myself I was protecting the truth, but I was just protecting my comfort. 3 years in a coma gave me time to think. Waking up to a choir outside my window gave me something to live for." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I'm not here to ask for your approval. I'm here to say if you've ever been wrong, it's not too late to be right. And sometimes being right means standing with the people you once stood apart from." The crowd erupted in applause. Some stood, some cried, and somewhere in the middle, Thomas thought he saw Mrs. Caldwell, her hands clasped, her face wet with tears. Backstage after the performance, Elijah handed him a towel and grinned. "You sang loud today." Thomas smiled. "I think I've finally found my sermon." The weeks after the Unity Festival were a blur. Some people embraced the change in him, others avoided him entirely. The media attention faded, but in his town, the the tension remained. Every trip to the grocery store or walk through the park was a reminder, some smiles, some stares, and the occasional muttered insult. But Thomas didn't mind the discomfort anymore. Discomfort meant he was moving. One morning, Angela wheeled a cart into his hospital room, carrying a neatly folded pile of clothes. "You've got a visitor," she said. When the door opened, Thomas's breath caught. It was Daniel, his estranged son. The last time they'd spoken was at a Christmas service 6 years ago, when Daniel had told him he was dating a black woman. Thomas's reaction had been swift and cruel. "You're spitting on your heritage, son." Daniel hadn't said a word, just walked away. Now, he stood in the doorway, taller than Thomas remembered, his arm around a woman with warm brown skin and kind eyes. "Dad," Daniel said quietly. "This is Amara." Thomas gripped the arms of his chair. I'm glad to meet you, Amara." Her smile was small but genuine. "Daniel thought you might not want to see me." "I would have said that once," Thomas admitted, voice cracking. "But once is over." They spent the afternoon talking about Amara's work as a teacher, about Daniel's job in Atlanta, about the years lost. At one point, Amara mentioned the video of him singing with the choir. "I showed it to my students," she said. "Some of them couldn't believe it. They've heard about the things you used to say." Thomas nodded slowly. "They have every reason not to believe in me. But maybe they can believe in change." When Daniel and Amara left, Thomas sat for a long time staring at the closed door, his chest heavy not with regret, but with gratitude that they had walked through it at all. A month later, Elijah approached him with a proposal. "We're holding a joint service, our church and another from the east side. I want you to speak." Thomas hesitated. "You're sure? Some of your congregations still don't trust me." Elijah smiled. "That's why it matters." The day of the service, the sanctuary was packed. Half the faces were strangers, half were from his old life. Some were members of his former church, sitting stiffly in the back. The choir filled the room with their voices first, the harmonies wrapping around the walls like sunlight. Then Elijah introduced him simply. "A man who once was blind in a way only the heart can bend who can see now." Thomas walked to the pulpit slowly, his cane tapping the floor. He gripped the sides, took a deep breath, and began. "I used to think God's kingdom was a gated community," he said. "I preached fences. I preached walls. And I told myself I was protecting the faith. But the truth was, I was protecting myself from fear, from change, from the idea that God might love people I didn't understand." He paused, looking out at the mix of faces, black, white, young, old. "Then I went asleep for 3 years. And when I woke up, the first thing I heard was the sound of people I once would have kept out singing me back to life." He told them about the courtyard, about the rain, about the note that said, "We believe in second chances." He didn't try to clean up his past or soften it. He let the ugliness stand, because only then could the grace be seen clearly. "I don't expect everyone to trust me yet," he said, "but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left earning that trust, not with words alone, but with the way I live." When he stepped down, there was a moment of stillness. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Not all of them, but enough. A few from his old church remained seated, arms crossed, but Thomas didn't focus on them. His eyes went to the front row, where Daniel and Amara sat, hands clasped, both smiling. The choir closed the service with a song that Thomas now knew by heart. Without hesitation, he joined them. After the service, as the congregation spilled into the sunlight, a small boy tugged on his sleeve. "My grandma says you used to be mean," the boy said matter-of-factly. Thomas chuckled softly. "She's right." The boy tilted his head. "You're not mean now?" "I'm trying not to be," Thomas said. The boy grinned. "Good. You sing funny, but I like it." Then he ran off, leaving Thomas laughing in the doorway. Months passed, and Thomas's health improved enough for him to leave the hospital. He moved into a small apartment not far from the New Hope Church. On Sundays, he sang with the choir, sometimes in the front row, sometimes in the back. He visited schools with Amara to talk about history and reconciliation. He even attended Daniel's wedding celebration, where gospel music and traditional hymns blended into something beautiful and whole. The letters from his old congregation still came, but they no longer carried the same weight. For every angry note, there was one from someone who was questioning, softening, daring to imagine a different way. One letter came from Mrs. Caldwell again. "I've been singing with a choir at my church. Never thought I'd say that. Thank you for making me uncomfortable enough to change." 3 years to the day after he first woke up, Thomas stood once more in that same hospital courtyard. The choir was there, robes brighter than the morning sun. Angela stood at the edge, smiling. Elijah gave him a nod. The song began rich, deep, alive. Thomas closed his eyes and let the sound fill him, not as something foreign, but as something that had become part of him. And in that moment, he knew his coma hadn't just been a pause in his life. It had been a resurrection. As the last note hung in the air, Elijah stepped forward. "Thomas," he said, "we've been singing around you and with you. But today, I think we can say you're one of us." The choir erupted in applause, pulling him into their circle. Thomas felt the warmth of their hands on his shoulders, heard the laughter and the music blending into one. For the first time in his 70 years, there were no walls left, only a window wide open and the sound of life pouring in. He looked up at the blue sky, the sunlight spilling through the leaves, and whispered the words that had changed him. "We believe in second chances." That was the last time Thomas ever thought of his past as something to be hidden. From then on, it was a testimony. And every time the choir sang, he knew this was the song that had saved him. And in a way, he was still waking up. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.